It was the late 1800s in the heartland of America, where the great open plains stretched endlessly and the horizon burned golden under the setting sun. The railroad was the lifeline of small towns, bringing in letters, goods, and sometimes new people who had left their pasts behind in search of a different kind of life. In one of these small towns of Nebraska lived a farmer named Thomas Miller, a man of quiet manners and a face worn from years of hard labor. His farm was modest, his home built by his own hands, nothing more than a small log house with a crooked roof and a porch that groaned whenever someone stepped upon it. Thomas had been alone for years. His wife, Anna, had passed during one of the cruelest winters the land had ever seen, leaving him with nothing but memories and the long silence of empty rooms. Each evening, he sat by the fire, staring at the flames, the quietness pressing against his chest until he felt as though he were being buried alive in loneliness. Loneliness drove many men of that era toward the growing industry of mail-order brides. It was not love they sought in the beginning, but companionship, someone to share the weight of existence in such harsh lands. Letters traveled by rail, sometimes by horse, carrying promises and hopes between strangers. Thomas, though reserved, eventually sent his own letter through an agency. His words were simple, humble, not filled with poetry but with honesty, that he was a hard-working man who wanted someone to share his home, someone who could endure the plains and its storms, someone who would not fear silence. Weeks later, he received word that his request had been answered. A woman named Margaret would be coming on the train, leaving behind her old life to join him in this lonely corner of Nebraska. The day of her arrival, the entire town gathered at the small train station. It was not often that the people saw outsiders, and a mail-order bride was always a cause for gossip and curiosity. The children clung to their mothers' skirts, the men leaned against the posts with folded arms, and women whispered behind their gloved hands. The sound of the approaching train filled the air with hissing steam and rattling wheels, stirring the dust of the dry road. When the locomotive finally pulled in, the doors opened, and passengers began to step down. Then came Margaret. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she descended from the carriage. She was unlike anything the people had imagined. Taller than any man in the town, her shoulders broad, her stride heavy enough to make the wooden platform creak beneath her boots. Her long coat seemed to strain against her frame, her hat sat awkwardly atop a head that seemed almost too high for the world around her. Some children shrieked and hid, others stared wide-eyed. The whispers grew louder. Men muttered to each other, half in disbelief, half in unease. Thomas stood near the front, his hands clenched tightly at his sides, his heart hammering. He had expected a woman, yes, but not a giant. He was not a small man himself, but in front of her he felt like a boy. When she finally reached him, towering above him, her shadow almost swallowing his, the words slipped out of his mouth before he could stop them. "You're bigger than my house," he muttered, his voice trembling with shock. There was an awkward pause, and then silence fell over the station. Margaret looked down at him. At first her eyes seemed hard, ready for the laughter she had so often faced in her life. But then, when she saw no smile on his face, only raw surprise, her heart ached, her lips trembled, and her large hands clutched the handle of her suitcase tighter. Tears filled her eyes, glistening as they caught the afternoon light. She turned her head away quickly, ashamed of her own emotions. She had crossed oceans of ridicule, years of loneliness, believing that maybe here she could start anew, and yet the first words she heard in this new life cut her deeply. The townsfolk whispered louder, some chuckled cruelly, others shook their heads. Thomas felt the weight of shame pressing down on him. He had not meant his words to be cruel, but they had escaped without thought. And now he had wounded the very woman who had risked everything to come here. Margaret stepped past him, her tears silent but heavy, and walked toward the edge of the station, her massive frame both powerful and heartbreakingly fragile. That night Thomas sat in his small log house, the silence thicker than ever. He thought of her, sitting alone somewhere, her tears staining the earth. His guilt gnawed at him. He had invited her into his life, into his home, and instead of giving her welcome, he had given her pain. After hours of restless pacing, he finally lit his lantern and walked toward the barn where he suspected she might be resting. There she was, her figure hunched like a great mountain, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed softly. The sight of such a large, powerful woman reduced to quiet tears broke something inside Thomas. He approached slowly, his voice softer than the wind. "Margaret," he said gently, "I'm sorry." She did not look up at first. He continued, his words stumbling but sincere. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded. I've lived alone too long. My tongue has forgotten kindness. I only spoke because I was surprised. You are strong, stronger than the storms of this land. But I see more than your size. I see a woman who left everything behind for a chance at a life. That is courage. And I was a fool not to say so." Margaret slowly lifted her face, streaked with tears, her eyes searching his for any hint of mockery. But all she found was sincerity. His voice was unpolished, his words awkward, yet his eyes held something she had not seen in many years: respect. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she felt something soften inside her. A small, cautious smile touched her lips. The days that followed were not easy. The town remained skeptical of her. Whispers followed wherever she went. Some children dared each other to run close to her, then scamper away in fits of laughter. Yet, as the weeks passed, the whispers began to shift. Margaret worked alongside Thomas in the fields, carrying hay bales as though they weighed nothing, lifting beams that would have required 3 men, mending fences with hands steady and sure. She did not complain, did not falter. And when the day's work was done, she cooked meals that warmed the soul, sewed clothes with care, and sang softly in the evenings when the prairie winds howled outside. The town began to see her differently. What had once seemed strange now became extraordinary. Men admired her strength. Women respected her kindness. Children, once frightened, now followed her, eager to hear her stories of faraway places. Thomas, who had once felt small beside her, now felt proud. He saw not a giant, but a woman whose heart was as vast as her frame, whose presence filled his lonely home with light. One evening, months later, Thomas sat with Margaret on the porch of their home. The sun was sinking, painting the sky in fire and gold. He looked at her, her large hands resting gently on her lap, her eyes calm and steady as she watched the horizon. "You know," he said softly, "I was right that day at the station. You are bigger than my house, but you're also bigger than my fears, bigger than my loneliness, bigger than all the silence that once lived here." Margaret's eyes glistened again, but this time it was not from sorrow. She reached down and took his hand carefully, as though afraid she might crush it, but he held her tightly, showing her that she no longer had to hide her strength. In time, their story became one of legend in the town. People spoke of the giant mail-order bride who had arrived in tears but built a life with courage and tenderness. And for Thomas, who once lived with nothing but silence, she became not only his wife but the very heartbeat of his home.